Hey again, everyone. Fall in for another episode of Tactical Plastic Report, where I talk about my game Army Men, a game of tactical plastic. This week, I wanted to continue on with my tour of the setting that I was giving to folks before we had all of our beginning of the new year videos come out, but we've covered United Polymeria and we've covered the Sterile Republic. This week, I'd like to do something a little bit different and talk about Acrylica. The southernmost of all the nations of the Plastos Federation, Acrylica is sort of easy to overlook, if we're being honest, because while the others may have a lot of history of conflict, a lot of history of war, a very strong warrior culture, Acrylica has something of the opposite. Acrylica is a nation that values education, that values creativity, innovation, learning, understanding, diplomacy, and these are typically not things one thinks of when they think of a nation to be feared on the battlefield. However, as the saying goes, the devil shivers when a good man goes to war, and the same is true of Acrylica, because while war might be their last option, it is the last thing they choose to pursue. When they do choose to pursue it, they go all out. And their military, while it might be one of the smaller standing armies out of the Federation, it is one of the most elite, one of the most highly trained. And if we want to get technical, every citizen has the necessary training to be called up in times of emergency. So while many of them might be more inclined to provide medical service, disaster relief, to act as military scientists, Acrylican Special Forces, to say nothing of their standard army, are to be feared because they are capable of delivering precise surgical strikes exactly as needed, and then going back home once the job is done. But how do we get such an unusual culture and country? And the answer, well, goes back a couple of centuries to the time of some documents referred to as the Acrylican Accords. The way this worked is because Acrylica is relatively far apart from its northern neighbors. It also has some very mountainous terrain, meaning it's not super easy to access if you don't know where all the passes are, if you are not willing to put in the time and the energy to cross those mountains. And while there are rivers and streams that you can take boats down to major settlements in, that's not something that everybody's willing to do when exploring is not high on your priority. So they managed to avoid lots of the wars of succession, lots of the monarchies of their northern neighbors, until they themselves were already established as a nation. And that happened when major city-states, which had their own language, their own culture, their own, well, everything, reached out to one another, and they decided that they were going to form an alliance. They wanted a standing peace treaty where they would come together, their representatives would solve problems, they would share resources, they would share education, they would do all of those things that you do when you have an alliance with other peoples. And doing this managed to reduce the need for actual conflict, because when resources were being shared, when there were exchanges of culture, exchanges of, well, people, just in terms of trade, in terms of tourism, in terms of intermarrying, they were quickly becoming one nation. And so this allowed them to focus on solving problems, focus on building, on infrastructure, on the important things that come with running a country. And it also allowed them to keep their standing army relatively small because it wasn't truly necessary. But it also allowed for the forming of Acrylican errants, which is what they referred to as groups of people that they sent off into the wilderness to find out what was out there. They were essentially state-funded explorers. And so their job was to go out into the wilderness and find, where are there other resources, where are there other communities, where are there just things we should know about. So they are one part just adventuring party and one part military scouts. They're out gathering intelligence, trying to find out what's going on in the wider world? What are some things we need to know about back home? And this tradition has actually moved on into the modern day in Army Men. In the Plastos Federation, they have expeditionary forces, which are based off of this idea, so that any troops that can be spared will go out and they will look for enemy movements. They will look for other uncontacted groups of resinous persons who may not know what's going on, who may need protection from what's happening. They will try to find movements of Vespoids, and they will try to find just resources that they can use to keep this war going so they can win. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. We'll talk about them more when we get to the Federation itself. Once the Acrylican Accords actually formed this nation, they reached out and they eventually discovered all of the other nations to the north. And when they did this, their main concern was we need to put peace agreements in place, because Acrylica as a nation, while they themselves may not have desired war as a way to solve problems, they were very well aware that they might be in the minority when it comes to that. So they wanted to have some assurances in place that armed conflict would not suddenly descend upon them. And if it did, that there would be consequences for the people who broke those agreements. As such, Acrylica was the one nation that had agreements with all the other nations that eventually joined the Federation. And it was the fact that they had those agreements in place, that they were on good terms with everyone, even when those other nations might have been at war, that allowed the Federation to exist in the first place. Because when the nation that is now known as the Acetal Alliance was in fact two separate nations at war, that was when the Vespoids attacked. And during this attack, everyone came together despite their differences to face this very new, very inhuman threat. And Acrylica were the ones who had all of the experience of cooperation, of getting bureaucracy to move functionally and to get people to work together. And so they were the ones who first proposed the creation of the Plastos Federation in the first place. So while they may not have had the most powerful voice, they may not have been the oldest nation there, they were the ones who were bold enough to propose the idea that everyone should work together to combat this singular threat. And that carried a lot of weight because all of their allies knew that Acrylica had nothing to gain from doing this aside from ensuring they all survived, which was clearly something that was in everyone's best interests. And since that time, Acrylica has done its best to carry its weight throughout this fight. While their armed forces might not be as plentiful as other nations, they provide personnel, they provide material, they provide a lot of scientists to the military effort, they provide a lot of manufacturing. So Acrylican weapons are some of the finest constructed in all of the Federation. They are meant for precision, but not always power. And so they are something of an acquired taste, particularly their long-distance weapons. Their snipers are some of the most surgically skilled in the entirety of the Federation. But for folks who are looking for a little bit of the inspiration as to what led to this, Acrylica is a combination of what we see in the Tennessee hills, with the valleys in America, combined with the mountainous terrain that we see in Switzerland, along with a lot of Switzerland's attitude. And you'll see a lot of that nation reflected in Acrylica in other ways because they're a little bit on the paranoid side, if we're going to be honest. Not in that they are constantly looking for threats, they are constantly warding themselves against enemy action, but in that when you go through Acrylica as a nation, and if you look past all of the beautiful structures of their buildings and all of the picturesque landscapes, you start noticing there are protocols in place in the event something happens where they are invaded. You'll notice that lots of their buildings, have dead man switches or they have escape tunnels. You'll notice that many of the public bridges, particularly over what would be insurmountable gaps, are rigged to blow if someone pushes the right button and enacts the right protocols. The nation is very ready to defend itself, and that defense may seem a little extreme to those who are not actually from Acrylica. But for all the nations who just think of them as peaceniks with no real stomach for a fight, a small tour of the nation will show that they are more than willing to carry things to the furthest extreme if you threaten them in a way they are not willing to back down from. And that is something that several of their neighbors, and no few Vespoid nests, have learned to their chagrin. But this covers our third nation out of the setting. We have one more official nation to talk about in the future, and then after that, we have a discussion of the Federation itself. And then after that, well, the floor is open. I wanted to give folks kind of a tour of the setting and let folks know about what the different countries and their inspirations and how I made them to be what they are came from. What is something you would all like to see in future, well, installments of the show? What are some parts of the game you are curious about, whether it's on the mechanical front? Do you want to talk about, some of the systems that we use for character advancement, or how folks can interact with, the very tactical combat system that's in place? Or do you want to know more about the lore? Do you want to know more about the threats people are dealing with, or some of the major historical events, or anything else? Even, what's coming down the line, as I'm hoping for 2025, as I mentioned in my goals for this year's video that came out a little while ago. I want to expand the supplements that we have for this game, and I want to keep it going and try to build an actual base of interest in it beyond what we already have from folks who backed the Kickstarter and may have picked it up since then. But please leave all of those down in the comments below. Those are where I read them, my publisher reads them, and that's kind of how we determine what's getting folks' interest. But until next time, this has been another episode of Tactical Plastic Report, so fall out and great day gaming, everyone.